In the days of lace ruffles, perukes and brocade, Brown Bess was a partner whom none could despise. An outspoken, flinty-lipped, brazen-faced jade, with a habit of looking men straight in the eyes. At Blenheim and Ramillies, fops would confess they were pierced to the heart by the charms of Brown Bess. Though her sight was not long and her weight was not small, yet her actions were winning, her language was clear, and everyone bowed as she opened the ball. On the arm of some high-gaitered grim grenadier, half Europe admitted the striking success of the dances and routs that were given by Brown Bess. When ruffles were turned into stiff leather stocks and people wore pigtails instead of perukes, Brown Bess never altered her iron grey locks. She knew she was valued for more than her looks. "Oh, powder and patches was always my dress, and I think I'm killing enough," said Brown Bess. So she followed her redcoats, whatever they did. From the heights of Quebec to the plains of Versailles, from Gibraltar to Acre, Cape Town, Madrid, and nothing about her was changed on the way. But most of the empire which now we possess was won through those years by old-fashioned Brown Bess. In stubborn retreat or in stately advance, from the Portugal coast to the Corkwoods of Spain, she had puzzled some excellent marshals of France, till none of them wanted to meet her again. But later, near Brussels, Napoleon no less, arranged for a Waterloo ball with Brown Bess. She had danced till the dawn of that terrible day. She danced till the dusk of more terrible night. And before her linked squares his battalions gave way, and her long fierce quadrilles put his lancers to flight. And when his gilt carriage drove off in the press, "I have danced my last dance for the world," said Brown Bess. If you go to museums, there's one in Whitehall, where old weapons are shown with their names writ beneath. You will find her upstanding, her back to the wall, as stiff as a ramrod, the flint in her teeth. And if ever we English had reason to bless any arm save our mother's, that arm is Brown Bess. So in case you didn't recognise it, that was Kipling, of course, with his poem Brown Bess, the Army Musket 1700 to 1815. It actually went on a lot longer. I hope it's not too predictable of me to start a second episode in a row with a poem. But let's be honest, it's a bloody good one, right? You can't beat Kipling in my opinion. I'm sure he's now derided by modern scholars, but for old-fashioned patriots like me, he'll always be one of the best. I think my favourite Kipling poem is the Ballad of East and West. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it now, though I'm sure I shall when I eventually get round to covering the Northwest frontier. It's just a beautiful poem, look it up. But anyway guys, let me stop jabbering and focus, because if you haven't already guessed, today we are discussing the Brown Bess Musket, aka the British Army's muzzle-loading, smoothbore, flintlock, land pattern musket and its various derivatives. I'm joined in conversation by one of my favourite fellow YouTubers, Rob, from the amazing British Muzzleloaders channel. If you're not already subscribed, do go check him out. Before we begin though, I did want to ask a favour. I'm keen to avoid putting advertising on this podcast, so I'm hoping you can support me and keep the episodes coming by giving me a 5-star rating and writing a review on your podcasting app. Those chores will only take you a few seconds, but would really help to spread the word about the show and encourage a new generation of military history geeks like us. So for those of you who follow military history as closely as me, Rob needs no introduction. He and I had a great interview in season 1 about the Martini Henry rifle, so if you want to go back and check that out, please be my guest. But otherwise, let's begin. The Brown Bess. Can you talk to me, can you explain how the Brown Bess Musket came about? I know there was a number of different patterns, you know, eventually sort of the India pattern was the sort of became the mainstay, didn't it? But can you talk me through that progression and how we got there?
I guess without getting, there's obviously a lot of people and information out there that would be able to get right into the weeds, but essentially it comes out of the 1600s, and the sort of the way that I say system, but there really wasn't a system. There was just a trade, a gun trade, and they were talking primarily in the UK, obviously. That if a colonel was going to raise his regiment, which was the sort of way it was done back then he would be, having to foot the bill for everything. That weapons include, he had to source his own weapons, and this would be gone and sourced in the trade. So we need 1,000 muskets, call it, or 500 muskets, because the other 500 men in the battalion are going to be armed with pikes. So it's almost like a bespoke kind of system, is that I find a contractor who is going to get me what I need. And what you see as a result is just a hodgepodge of styles and we're talking sort of in the latter matchlock era here, like English Civil War kind of thing. And that the standardization across, I say the army, but even during the English Civil War, the new model army notwithstanding, I mean, it's very much almost a medieval style of raising an army, So it's got that same kind of real organic, sort of supply system. And the way that the Brown Bess kind of rises from the ooze, as it were, is, I mean, calibers were, generally speaking, fairly standardized in around 3/4 of an inch, 0.75. But would there be 0.8 and 0.7? There would have been. And I've actually, on that note, I've actually got some documentation talking about the sort of early mid 1700s, jumping ahead a little bit, that is giving specific direction to colonels to double check that the ammunition issued to their men fits their muskets. So even by the sort of well into the 1700s, there was, or the necessity for the precaution to, kind of make sure that the ammunition, the ball, fit barrel. What you see coming out of the 1600s is a gradual sort of formalization of the pattern of arm as the army becomes much more, a national entity, and the logistics behind it, likewise, is a pattern of musket called the pattern of 10,000, I think. And I get that reference from a DeWitt Bailey book who references as such. And it would be sort of the proto Brown Bess. And obviously there was 10,000 of these muskets sort of made as a large single pattern of arm for specifically the military. And there's a couple of other small patterns that come in there, but eventually what you end up with is the long land pattern musket. So it's not called the Brown Bess. The Brown Bess is very much a colloquialism, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, perhaps. But the official name of it is the land pattern musket. And of course, when what we know today being the long land pattern musket comes out, well, there is no short one, so you don't call it the long land pattern. You just call it the land pattern versus the sea service, so the sea pattern, the sea service musket. So it comes out of this gradual sort of formalization of the logistics system, is that we need to get the same weapon in the hands of all our soldiers. And this old style is almost private procurement, and the necessary changes within the arm that happen from batch to batch and maker to maker. They make the stocks this way, or this guy makes the stocks that way. And well, his barrels are kind of 0.75, but they generally are more towards the 0.8 kind of thing. They gradually over these sort of formative years of the late 1600s and early 1700s sort of nail that down. And what comes out of it is this the land pattern musket. And it's nominally 0.78 in caliber. And that's according to DeWitt Bailey. So it's a fairly, generous caliber. And of course, in that same time, we've spoken from the English Civil War on into the 1700s. The biggest change, apart from the patterning of these arms, of course, is the introduction and the complete replacement of the matchlock by the flintlock, which is, a quantum leap as far as our general firearms history and development go. We go from something with a serpentine that holds a slow match that's burning quietly away, and having to the procedures of having to make sure that's going to, when I want to fire, it's going to hit the pan, and there's a big song and dance that comes with that. So now we just need a rock in a set of jaws, and that rock hits a steel, or what was termed the hammer back in the time, and that creates a spark, which then ignites a powder in a pan. And initially they try a couple of patterns. The snap hats is a type of lock that relies on exactly the same principle, but it's much more complicated. It's almost a hybrid. The pan has its own cover to keep out the damp and to keep the powder in the pan when you're moving around. But the steel, or the hammer as it were, is on a separate piece, mounted separate and distinct from the pan. But it's angled in a way that you would be familiar with if you knew what a flintlock looked like. And the cock holding the flint strikes that, which then moves out of the way. But before you do that, you have to open the pan cover. So you can see the sort of the embryonic stages of a true flintlock. And this, the pan cover and the hammer, or the steel, now we call that the frizzen, are become attached. And the function of striking the steel, creating the spark, and opening the pan are combined, which of course leads to a single step. Well, if you include bringing the piece to full cock and then firing it, it's actually 2 steps. But as far as pulling the trigger and making the firearm go off, it's a 1-step process. Now, instead of having to open something and set up all that kind of stuff. So it's a big deal. So when I talk about these early patterns of musket becoming common, I don't want to overshadow that importance of the introduction of the flintlock. It's somewhat more weatherproof, because you're not dealing with something that's burning in the open in terms of your slow match with a matchlock musket. So we come out in the early 1700s with this land pattern musket, and that serves in, there are some stylistic changes that occur, but it's a true flintlock. And that musket ends its service sort of life by the 1780s. That the grenadier companies of British battalions were still equipped, nominally, mind you, notwithstanding any supply issues and that kind of stuff, but right up until the American War of Independence.
And why specifically grenadier companies? Why grenadier companies?
Because in the grenadier companies, they were typically chosen from the earliest of times as being big sort of assault troops. And they were called the grenadier company because at the time, the thought was a lot of siege warfare predominated, especially in Europe. And they perceived this need of individuals that would throw grenades, so bombs. So what happens is the function, the tradition of having these large men within a battalion, within one of the companies of a battalion, is maintained long after the function of the grenade is past. So with the reduction in this kind of siege warfare that predominates in the before the 1700s, particularly Vauban, those types of names get thrown around, those big star-shaped forts, all that era, that was very much a focus of European warfare. So the grenades sort of come out of service, but we have this tradition of having the biggest, strongest men all concentrated into one company. At the time, sort of 9 companies in a battalion, 8 line companies and 1 grenadier. This is later augmented by a light company, who were almost the opposite of the grenadiers, if you will. I know it's a bit long-winded, but the reason why the long pattern is maintained within the grenadier companies is because of its extra length and, shall we say, awkwardness. When you're big and tall, you have the better ability to manage that in terms of reach, in terms of being any kind of assaulting formation. You've got longer reach on your bayonet, that kind of stuff. So that's essentially why it's the long, as we know it to be after the introduction later of the later patterns. The long land pattern lasts where it does within that particular organization because they're the big, strong guys. To me, it's interesting is that there's these evolutionary sort of ebbs and flows, and whereas things are created or types of troops are created for a specific role, they, over time, the reason for their creation ebbs, but the tradition remains. And sometimes they're redesignated or they're sort of retasked, as it were. And to this day, the function of the Grenadier Company, obviously within an infantry battalion, isn't the case anymore. But if we look at, say, the Queen's Birthday Parade, which is the Trooping of the Colour in London, when the escort to the colour, or in the case, escort for the colour, as it is before the function happens of taking the colour into their ranks, they are positioned on the right of the line.
Either left! Quick march!
And when they march forward to receive the colour, to pick it up and then troop it through the ranks, the tune that is played as that company, or that guard, as it were, is marching forward to receive the colour, and you can, this is all on YouTube if your listeners are interested. The march they play is the British Grenadiers. And that is specifically because the company that paraded on the right of the battalion was the Grenadier Company. So that's an interesting side point, that tradition in albeit reduced form still exists today. But that's why the long land pattern lasts where it does. About the mid 1700s, they realized that maybe the length is not necessarily required, and they bring it upon themselves to maybe let's shorten things, and they bring it down to a 42-inch barrel and designate it the short land pattern. Essentially, it's the same musket, it's just shorter. There are some other cosmetic differences in terms of the lock plate, and over the century, essentially the 1700s, that is, you see a general reduction in the word escapes me right now, but the detail that's put into making them. The ornamentation is the word I was looking for. Some of the small pieces, the spring that holds the tension on the hammer steel and pan cover, it's got some cuts made in the little finial on the end where the screw goes in, and that changes over time. The shape of the lock plate with the long pattern is typically quite curved, so it's very organic looking. But not only is it curved when you look at it from the side, but it's also curved in its face. So someone's had to file that to give that sort of profile to it. By the end of the century, those kinds of details are the new land pattern musket, for instance, that comes in at the beginning of the 1800s, albeit in a very limited fashion. It's got a flat lock plate, flat. So cut this piece of metal out, file it flat. All that detail over these 100 years slowly wanes because they realize that, well, warfare is getting bigger and we need more people and more of everything. And to simply, incorporate some of these details, it's foolish, really, because we're paying money for somebody to sit and engrave things and to file things around when they could just make it flat. And the function, of course, doesn't change. So they introduced the short pattern. And this is the predominant weapon used during the American War of Independence, the American Revolution. So your line companies would be carrying those, and that's, of course, the majority of the army. And the Grenadier companies are the last vestige of the use of the long land pattern. And after the American War of Independence, essentially that long land pattern just fades into history, as it were. And the short land pattern maintains its sort of precedence right up until the 1790s. And at that point, the trade, as it were, just can't produce to the point that it needs to, especially with these Napoleonic wars, sort of the French Revolutionary Wars, and Europe's just going, in terms of its stability, is going down the toilet. As it does from time to time, admittedly, but they realize that we need more muskets, and they look around, and within the call it the British system, because the East India Company is essentially, especially by this point, it's its own thing, and as far as your listeners go, it basically rules India as a proxy government. It started off very much so as a trading organization, but very quickly it is given the privilege, as it were, by its charter of governing India. And this includes pacification of areas. So essentially, the East India Company has its own army. And in doing so, it develops along a parallel but separate line from the British Army, and they developed their own pattern of musket. And it's shorter than the Shortland pattern yet again, a 39-inch barrel, and it lacks some of the finishing qualities. Today, especially when you look at examples or the originals of the Shortland pattern and what becomes the East India pattern or the India pattern musket, it's really hard to see the differences in terms of economies and lesser finishing. But that's because they're 200 years old and they've all been bashed around a lot. So having never seen a brand new example of both, I can only rely on some references. And generally speaking, they all refer to the finishing. So the fitting of the parts, the wood to metal fit, the standard of oiling, the standard of finishing of the metal. Not to say they were junk by any means. I mean, mine is an India pattern made in Britain, and the finishing looks wonderful to me. But again, it's all relative, right? But what they have is this ability to purchase the British system in order to augment its numbers of muskets when the Napoleonic Wars and the Revolutionary Wars sort of kick off and become to a head. They end up purchasing muskets from the East India Company, and those enter service in British Army service as the India pattern musket. And later on, they realize that the economies afforded, little things like the number of tubes that hold the ramrod under the stock. In the Shortland pattern, there's 4, including the main one at the base, at the swell, where the ramrod disappears into the stock. There's 4 in total, whereas in the India pattern, there's only 3. So, obviously in economy, there's 1 fewer part, less brass, less fitting, less time in manufacture. All these little details add up. And essentially, the India pattern becomes, or it is adopted in British service, and they're made new in Britain. They always were, but they were made for the East India Company. Now they're being made for the British Army and British forces. And that is the weapon that is used throughout the real Napoleonic kind of era, as far as the 1800s, the Peninsula, Waterloo, all that kind of stuff.
And how effective a weapon was it compared to the earlier models? I mean, I know they'd simplified it. Had it become a better weapon, a more effective weapon, I should say, or was it actually not as good as those earlier, more elaborate models?
I would say militarily speaking, and when taking the whole sort of military experience as a whole, no, they weren't more effective. I suppose there could be some sort of argument made that if you had a long land pattern musket with next to an India pattern musket and on a range, all benched, rested, and the utmost of care taken in loading and all that kind of stuff, you might be able to demonstrate some sort of superior accuracy by the extra few inches of barrel. Might, but on top of that, with perfectly fitting ammunition, a clean barrel, but also in the environment that you're using it in, I would say that if you take that and you replace it with the military kind of experience, so this means in action from a standing position predominantly, perhaps kneeling. So now you're taking away all benefit of resting and good aim and that kind of thing. That you also add in any kind of stress related to being in action. Also reacting to words of command. So you're also firing typically on command, which means you don't have the luxury of, like you would at a range doing testing, taking your time, making sure you're sighting the weapon as best you can. These things go out the window when you're talking about a military context. You present your firelock and you fire it when I say fire. Now, if you happen to be in the middle of a breath at that point and your musket happens to be slightly elevated, well, then your bullet's going to go high. But you had to fire when you were told to fire, or as close as you could anyway. So when you say that, is there a difference in effectiveness? No. People will perhaps argue about reach of a long land with its bayonet versus that of a short or an India pattern. In reality, maybe in a fencing class, you might get an advantage, but the battlefield is not a fencing class. And typically, if you're at the point of having to use your bayonet, you're either standing watching someone bear down on you, or you're the guy who is bearing down on somebody. And somebody, in all anecdotal, or not say, but the vast majority of anecdotal examples, before those bayonets cross, somebody runs away. The people that are attacking stop and run back because they lose their nerve, or the people that are being attacked are already sort of compromised in some way. When they see the evidence of someone coming at them through the smoke, through a cheer, through physically being close enough to see them from the outset, they realize that, oh, geez, we're in a bad state and let's get out of here. So I know, again, that's a bit of a detailed answer. It could have been easier saying yes or no, but I find it interesting when you talk about these kinds of things, because a lot of people sort of, it's an easy, I don't mean this in any kind of disparaging way, but it's an easy thing to focus on, which one's better, and I'd take this over that any day. Well, perhaps those kinds of arguments have specific reasons attached to them, but as far as the way I look at it, is very much as best I can in that military context. And the fire delivered by a volley of, say, 100 men in 1740 with long land pattern muskets would be essentially the same as a volley delivered by 100 men in 1800 with India pattern muskets, or 1809, or pick a day out there. That it's very much governed by the realities of what the weapon is. We haven't talked we've only brushed on it briefly at this point, but the other huge factor in establishing the effectiveness, and by that I mean sort of its accuracy and rate of fire and all that kind of thing, is the ammunition. And ammunition of the era was in a paper cartridge, which was a combination of a ball wrapped up in a paper tube. Varying countries used varying styles of manufacture. There are examples of internal holes that separate the ball from in the process of rolling the paper up, which is one way to sort of separate them. You can't just, well, yeah, I guess you could, but it's less effective to just make a roll of paper tight around a ball with a wooden dowel, and then tie one end off next to the bullet, and then dump powder in it. Because what happens is, over time and over movement in a pouch, through handling, that powder will migrate past the ball into the wrong end of the cartridge. So what you end up seeing in a lot of examples, and there's, believe it or not, there's not many left as far as originals go, and some of them are perhaps later in the era, even moving on into the Victorian era. But what you see is some sort of separation within that cartridge. That within a fold of paper or a second string that's choked the bullet on the powder side, and this prevents that powder migration. So this paper cartridge is rolled up with powder, so it's almost self-contained, with the sense of there's no primer in it. You can't load the whole thing and expect it to shoot, because it's meant to use, obviously, with the flintlock. So a part of that becomes the priming. So when you rip the powder end of the cartridge off, you place that powder in the pan and then shut the pan by closing the hammer and the pan cover, which is, of course, all attached on top of that. And then you go about taking the rest of the powder and pouring it down the barrel. And then, which is commonly, there's a lot of stuff out there about ammunition, the way you load these things. Maybe you want to talk about later, but in a nutshell, at this point, it's very efficient, because you've already torn the end of the cartridge off, and the prescribed method to use it is that you simply take it and pour it down the barrel. And in doing so, you empty this sort of powder, let's call it the powder end of the cartridge, which becomes an empty paper tube. Now that paper tube is approximately the same diameter as the bullet. And what that enables you is simply to, almost in one motion, pour the powder and then let go and place the cartridge in the muzzle. And in a clean barrel, it'll actually just slide right down. But then in that process, as it's sliding down, the powder's emptying and falling to the bottom of the barrel. When the barrel's fouled, typically that paper with the bullet inside it will sort of hang up at the muzzle just through fouling that's created by burning of the black powder, and the paper just sort of grabs. It's nothing that you can't overcome by very light pressure, but it holds things right at the muzzle. Of course, the whole reason behind being able to load it like this and relatively easily is the size of the bullet. And the size of the bullet is typically around 0.69. So you've got in early versions of the land pattern, you've got a 7.8 barrel, 78 caliber. Of course, these, in terms of the minutia, the differences between musket to musket and batch to batch and manufacturer to manufacturer, they're still there, but they're generally reduced. But by the time you get to the India pattern, it's been reduced to 7.5. So you have a 7.5 caliber barrel, and you've got a 6.9 caliber ball. And simple math tells you that there's a large number, or large degree of what we call windage, space between the size of the ball and the inside of the barrel. This partly is taken up with the paper, but the combination of paper and ball is still remarkably smaller than the inner diameter of the bore. And this is a necessity. Militarily speaking, if you don't have a certain degree of windage, you will never be able to use the musket past 1 or 2 rounds. So obviously these weapons are used routinely for extended periods of time, especially between cleaning, because cleaning is a bit of an evolution in itself. So this small ball and the relatively large caliber of the musket exists through the entire period. What this does, and as I mentioned at the beginning, is this real essential difference between being very accurate and not accurate, and speaks to the effectiveness, as it were, of one or the other, is the windage. When you fire, that powder burns and it essentially will blow by the bullet, and the gases will escape past it and actually exit the barrel before the bullet will. In doing so, that bullet has a certain degree of latitude as it travels down the barrel, and it bounces, essentially. This is to some degree mitigated slightly by the inclusion of this paper within the cartridge, and it forms a very rudimentary sabot, if you will, as it gets crushed up on top of the powder but below the ball as you've loaded it. But still, there's a lot of windage, and when that barrel leaves, it's got some irregularities to it. It may be on one side of the barrel as it leaves the muzzle, and those gases that are pushing behind it, if it does leave to one side, they'll want to escape following the path of least resistance out between the large gap on one side of the ball and the side of the barrel. And what this does is it creates more pressure. And just like blowing on something, it wants to push to that side. And what you see then is, of course, that ball flying off the line of the barrel. And this could happen, in any kind of random way. It could be up, left, down, right, any which way possible. So the ball is not set up for success in the modern sense of a modern bullet fired out of a rifle. So no matter if you've got a long land pattern or an India pattern, that effect is maintained the entire way through. And it is a severely limiting factor in the accuracy of a smoothbore flintlock military musket. You can shoot these things relatively accurately when using a combination of, like in a modern sense, a target shooting sense, with wads and patches and all this kind of thing, none of which have even the slightest relevance to any kind of military application whatsoever. At all. Nobody has them. Nobody carries them. Nobody's issued them. It's just, it is very much a modern solution to trying to make these better, because they're smoothbore. Of course, the final thing that really affects their effectiveness and that doesn't differentiate between these patterns is that they are smoothbore, and that the stability of that bullet has been affected as it leaves the muzzle by the escaping gases, by the way it's bounced off the inside of the barrel, and it's whatever it hits last, it will affect it on its flight, kind of thing. But also the ball, a sphere, is inherently stable flying through the air, and that the only way it does become stable really is by spinning. And that's why when you watch, I guess, I mean, even a cricketer will do the same thing. A baseball player does the same thing. When they throw that ball and they want to put it straight where they want it, that when it rolls off their fingers, it's spinning. But in a smoothbore, that doesn't exist. So not only is that bullet, bouncing down the barrel, the gases are affecting it adversely as it leaves the muzzle, but then it's going to fly in a certain direction. But because it's not spinning, it's going to wobble in the air. And I know in terms of baseball, there's a type of pitch that you throw that limits the amount of spin you put on the ball, and by doing so makes it unstable through the air and very hard for the person who's batting at it to track it through and be able to hit it. So these things all combine. So we have windage, we have adversely affecting trajectory, but also the fact that it doesn't spin in the air. As I say, if you could prove that few extra inches of barrel on a long land pattern would give you an advantage in musketry over an India pattern, it would be really, really difficult. And then apply the military context, and that takes any shred of possibility away from that, in my mind anyway.
And my understanding is, Rob, I mean, you've shot these a lot. They were never meant to be aimed. There's no sights on them, right? You just kind of point it in the direction of the attacking column and pull the trigger and hope for the best. Is that essentially how the sort of doctrine of using these things was?
I suppose if you compare it to something modern with front and a back sight, then yes, to say that they weren't aimed. And I'm no expert in the sort of mid 1700s, the sort of 7 Years' War era, 1740s, that kind of thing. But my understanding, and I could be corrected of this, and I'd be happy to be corrected, but my understanding of the platoon exercise of the era, and the platoon exercise speaks to the drills that are taught in order to produce fire with your musket. So how to hold it, how to load it, how to fire it. The details of the platoon exercise at that point very much speak to a leveling of the musket in that word, and also the position of the head up off of the stock, off of the butt. And so you're not you're looking along the barrel, but you're not looking right along the barrel, if you will. You can hold a broomstick up to your shoulder and squint along it. Obviously, there's no sights on a broomstick, but you can also just put it in your shoulder and stick your head up. And that difference in space then illustrates the point I'm trying to make here. So very much in the middle of the 1700s, that seems to be the case. So what you see coming into the Napoleonic age is an increased reference to parts of the musket and techniques that when you read them, it sounds very much like aiming. In some cases, it's looking along the barrel from the breech nail to the sight, or the bayonet lug, as it were. Because all these muskets, although they don't have sights per se, there is a lug that's placed on the front of the barrel where a sight typically would be, and this is used to secure the bayonet. However, it is used in some of the period texts and referred to as a sight. But what, of course, they completely lack is any kind of back sight. So you're relying on the sort of the contour of the barrel. The barrel is obviously the thickest at the breech, where it has to contain the biggest pressures. And the tang that comes off the back of the barrel is the piece that is, there's a hole in it and a screw, commonly known as the breech nail. And this holds the breech in the wood. And you see references to this line of sight being prescribed. So look along the barrel from the breech nail to the front sight, I say front sight. That's sort of the way it is discussed as being, but obviously its sort of primary function is holding the bayonet in place. In the process of ramping up the series on the Bess on the channel, I've had the opportunity to read some of these things, and even within the same manual, there are different instances and descriptions of its use and the prescription of its use. So when we look at sort of the basic platoon exercise, and this stemming from the 1804 exercise. It talks about when your recruits are being taught the motions of how to hold it, and pouring the powder down the barrel and all that kind of thing. They are told to use and look along the barrel, sort of in very simple form of description. When we move into a part of the manual known as the firings, which is how you present your fire as a group. So when you're standing in ranks, who does what, who steps where, all that kind of thing. It just increasing from an individual level of maneuver into a group sort of level. There's a little bit more detail in terms of how you look along the barrel. And then when you move within the same manual, when you move into the light infantry drill, which admittedly at this time isn't necessarily practiced by everybody, just those designated as light infantrymen. It goes into quite a bit of detail, using the barrel from the breech nail to the sight and looking along it at your mark. So as I say, it's interesting that these early manuals don't have one standard throughout. There seems to be this sort of, in some states, a gradual training progression, but also just in the use of the English language in terms of its descriptive capabilities in pointing it that way. So to say that they were not aimed, again, a bit of context. There is certainly indication that you have to look along the barrel because there is a target that you need to hit at and you need to point it at that target. Whereas earlier in the century or in the 1700s, presumably you were so close that leveling, making it parallel to the ground, was what was important. And looking along it, by one eye along the barrel wasn't thought of as being required. By the 1800s, this seems to be changing, and some direction to how to aim the smoothbore musket is given. Yeah. So in 1803, if my memory serves me correct, the light infantry pattern musket is introduced for the light infantry, both the foreign battalions and nominally the light infantry companies within battalions. To what extent that actually happens can be, depending on logistical issues, somewhat suspect. But generally speaking, it is documented that it was used extensively, and it has a back sight on it. And so this very simple addition of a back sight to a smoothbore musket, it's got some other details. It's got a brass sort of pistol grip style scroll trigger guard. All these things to aid the level of, shall we say, comfort for the shooter, able to bring the musket up, look across the sights, and engage a target more effectively. Of course, in the light infantry battle, your targets are often individuals, just like you yourself are standing with your file mate, but the next guy beside you might be a few meters away. So you're fighting in this no man's land battle against people who are doing the same thing. So you can completely understand that the thought was there and the perceived need of having a weapon that was more suited to that kind of fighting. And one of the primary things to do then is give it a set of sights. So what you're doing, you're limiting that sort of, you got to stick your tongue out the side of your mouth, and you got to stand on one leg and squint a certain way to get that sight, that look along the barrel to make sure that you can be as accurate as possible. Well, you sort of take that out of the equation now. And by the addition of this back sight, you greatly increase the effectiveness, especially at these shorter ranges. It's just so much easier to aim it, especially with a bit of practice, knowing how to, there's the sight picture to take, where to aim on a person, given a certain range. These sorts of things were practiced by the light infantry, and you would have become sort of aware of, through your training as a light infantry soldier, about how to use your weapon effectively. So, yes, they were aimed, essentially, in a nutshell. What we consider aiming today is not quite where they were at, but certainly it was very much an embryonic state. And it only gets, as the century progresses, the 1800s that is, it obviously gets much more refined and effective.
Well, you obviously have shot a Brown Bess a lot, and there's a lot of YouTube videos that people can go watch of that. But can you just give us a sort of summation of how accurate you found the weapon to be, and at what sort of ranges you think you would be able to hit a human-sized target generally.
Right. I've shot mine. I limited at this point to 100 yards, and I was shooting at a target that was at about 5 feet high and 2.5 feet to 3 feet wide, and just put a big black dot in the middle of it. It was used, the particular target I'm referring to, the reason why I can't tell you exactly the dimensions is because it was used for another project and it was scaled. So it's got some weird number of inches and fractions to make it representative of a target placed at greater range. So, so far, that's the sort of target I've defaulted to because I see that as being, big enough that it'll accommodate all these inefficiencies in the system, but also me, and not being, the best of shots. I'm not the best of shots at the best of times, but when you take the sights out of it, it's a lot more practice, a lot more just gut feeling of how to hold it properly. How much of that front sight of that bayonet lug am I supposed to be able to see at a given range over top of the hump of the breech? And that's essentially how you're gauging this sort of elevation. But then you take that sight picture and then you aim at the top, aim at the bottom, aim at the middle. These are the sort of things that one does when you're trying to get a Brown Bess to shoot well in a military kind of context. So, can I hit that target at 100 yards? Yes, I can. That's obviously taking my time. I recently completed a project, as far as time goes, completed a project that involved a little bit of on the clock shooting, as it were. It was surprising to me coming out of that experiment. The loading is, I sort of here nor there. I can load it not exceptionally fast by any means, but relatively efficiently. But the time I found it took to aim it, because it just simply, it's not easy. And it takes a lot of concentration in my mind to remember where I was supposed to hold and how much of the sight am I supposed to see, and then place that on the target. And then the last thing that comes into play when shooting it is the lock and the trigger pull. These locks are big, the springs are big, they're heavy. The amount of metal that's moving when you fire it is significant. And the luxury of a light trigger pull is non-existent. So when you're pulling that trigger, it's an effort. And that will affect, sort of the accuracy of the musket when you fire it. More practice at it, the better you get, like with everything. But it's just something that, for instance, shooting the Baker or shooting other later Victorian arms, be them percussion lock or whatnot, that refinement of the lock, the size of the springs, everything's a lot smaller and a lot finer, so that the spring pressures are less and it's easier to fire for sure. So these are the little things that I've picked up in learning how to shoot the best. By no means where I probably could be if I spent, 3 years down the road. Once I've spent more time, I'll probably be better at it, like most people are when they practice. Militarily, they didn't shoot a lot, but interestingly enough, there was allotments made for practice ammunition. I think it was 20 or 30 rounds for the line. That is to say, the normal infantry, for practice purposes every year. So there was, this is in the sort of the Peninsular era, sort of early 1800s. So there was a lot made for practicing and target shooting. The targets that would have been used in the line infantry context wouldn't have been the same necessarily as those in the light infantry context, and more geared towards what their typical sort of enemy would look like, which is much like the line, standing up, essentially shoulder to shoulder, and presenting that so-called masked target. These details of how to aim and whatnot, over and above, would have been focused on the collective firing of a given unit, of a given company, or half company or whatnot. So when you get into the light infantry side of things get a lot more individualized, and individuals firing at a single target and assessment made of their shooting. and learning how those muskets and rifles, which we'll get to in a minute perhaps, are actually how they shoot, where to aim, because my rifle likes, I have to aim here to hit the target or I want it, et cetera, et cetera. So the light infantry have a little bit more opportunity to establish that than perhaps the line does. The thing about that's sort of frustrating in terms of the material that I'm making for the channel is the lack of the references. They just simply aren't there in the detail that you'd love them to be. And a lot of anecdotal, examples need to be read. And I've had a lot of great help on the channel in regards to that, by learned individuals who have volunteered and found information that is relevant to this kind of thing, which puts things and fills out some of the blanks that are left by the ambiguity in some of the manuals. Obviously, with the projects I do on the channel, the manuals are always the first thing to go to, and provide the lion's share often of any of the material that I'm trying to sort of present. So it's been a wonderful and really exciting kind of journey so far. When we get shorter ranges than that 100 yards, your sort of chances of hitting and coming as far as a grouping go, get smaller. Obviously, it's physics. And the amount of time that you need to spend in concentration in aiming is obviously reduced as well when those ranges get really close. And it speaks to, though, that so much, especially anecdotally, of the warfare of the era, is below that sort of 100-yard threshold. And you can understand that, if we're able to hold our fire till 50 yards before we do, then that gives an advantage. Especially if we're able to shelter, whether we're lying down until the very last moment when we sort of stand up out of the corn and present ourselves, and the enemy sees us appear essentially out of nowhere. It could be the corn, it could be wheat, it could be a hill, a ditch, something like that. But that shock value, and then the immediate discharge at exceptionally close range of everybody's musket, followed again by the characteristic cheer and a charge, and you can piece together this pattern of warfare that's used again and again and again. And honestly, it's used by sort of all sides to varying degrees.
One thing I should ask, actually, that you alluded to a bit earlier, was the name Brown Bess. Where did that name come from? And are all of these different, the land pattern and the short pattern and the India pattern, are they all called the Brown Bess? And if so, where did that nickname come from?
It's one of those things that has been really lost in time, really, that I don't think there's a single specific reference as to how and why it got called that. But interestingly enough, its colloquial use extends right up until the adoption of rifles as a general arm of the Army, which is the 1850s. So people are still referring to the percussion-locked smoothbore musket as the Brown Bess. I would say typically today, the Brown Bess refers to a flintlock, of the 17 and early 1800s. Essentially, when someone says Brown Bess, that's what they think of. But when you read like journal entries, like the Royal United Services Institute, which is like a professional military journal, there's all kinds of references in the 1830s and 40s to the Brown Bess. And you read other sort of histories from the 1800s, looking back sort of from the Victorian or the mid-Victorian era back to the early Victorian or sort of Napoleonic era, and they are referring to the Brown Bess as the in the 1830s and 40s, which is has moved in well into the percussion era. So that name sort of has stuck, and I, through looking at these works, that it is essentially seems to me that name refers to the smoothbore musket. And although at some point, whether it's a fairly modern occurrence or not, it sort of encompassment shrinks, if that's a word, shrinks back to that sort of flintlock, Napoleonic and 1700s era weapon. There's all kinds of stories out there about the color of the barrel is one of them. Incidentally, barrels weren't browned until very, very late. They certainly were after the Napoleonic era. But for the most part, for the life of the Brown Bess, through its entire lifespan, they were polished bright. The men used to use brick dust and polish them and get rid of the rust, so that bright, shiny barrel was something. So I don't know how you could, associate a name like that with the detail coming from a specific aspect of the weapon when it never had a brown barrel for the vast majority of its lifespan. So that's one of them. The other one is the color of the stock. Okay, that to me, that really, it's brown wood, like all wood is, with the exception perhaps of a sea service musket, which is painted black. Got it. Again, it's kind of grasping at straws, as the term goes. The other side of it, the best side of it, there's often an association made with a bastardization of a German word for, I think it's Busch, like for gun, or the exact, not up in my German translations, but this is just things that I'm picking out of my head and things I've read before, that was a corruption of that term. Maybe, I don't know what necessarily, there may have been some sort of association. To date, and I by no means am saying this is what it is, but to me, to date, the best reason for this name in being in existence is actually given, pretty sure now, I'm just double checking myself, is on the Royal Armoury's website. I think it's the Royal Armoury's website. And there's a paper that's written about this very question. And the deductions that and I can't remember the author of the paper, but the deductions that are drawn from it are interesting because to me, they're sort of the most soldierly. If we can associate perhaps a somewhat loose and crass sense of humor associated to soldiery in general, I think generally speaking, that can be the case. That the term Bess is described as being a name that is somewhat pedestrian and perhaps associated to women of less than particular virtue who may frequent business at night. In that sense, these types of people, and this is all laid out in the article, which is very interesting, these types of people were people that soldiers perhaps would gravitate to, moving from billet to billet, that they're looking for a bit of conjugal company. Well, they have no time, they have no resources, they have no money to swoon somebody out of the local village. But there are some individuals who might accept, some perhaps currency, maybe. Or maybe they're just like to frequent those types of establishments that find a lot of soldiers visiting. I'm going down a bit of a rabbit hole here, and by no means I'm trying to point fingers at people. However, this is, again, the realities of the era. And so the association with, those individuals being a Bess, like I go downtown and get me a Bess tonight, because that's what I feel like doing. This is where that name, the best part of the name, perhaps, as is postulated in the article, comes from. So there's all kinds of anecdotal examples of soldiers sort of naming their rifles after a woman or some such. And maybe that this kind of association is where this best part of the name comes from. And the brown comes from an examination of contemporary English, and brown being used as a word to describe something that's very plain, which obviously it is, but to say that, it's not colorful, it's not, striking, but for something to be brown is very plain and sort of unremarkable, like the musket. So not the color of the musket, but the fact that it's just an ordnance pattern, land pattern musket. There's nothing special about it. So the weapon itself is quite plain, and not in the terms of, again, its ornamentation, although the India pattern is lacking some of the stuff that the earlier patterns do. But the same thing can be said even today, I would expect. If you take what the military gives somebody as the typical military rifle, and then you take a civilian rifle, whether it be for sporting or some such, and there might be engraving on it, it might have all kinds of extra bits and pieces, modern things attached to it. The highest in technology of accessories that maybe the military can't afford or doesn't provide. You can see that same kind of that relationship with something that's being just bog standard, plain, unremarkable, and the term brown being used to describe that. And so anyway, that to my mind, reading that article, it really kind of resonated in me as being, chances are the simplest explanation is probably the one that is in reality the one. And all these things about German translations of words and whatnot in an English-speaking army, and I don't know. When you talk about relating to the plain and loose women, those are two things that one might be able to associate with soldiery of the era. They end up calling their musket that, the Brown Bess.
Probably an unfair question, so tell me if this is one you can answer. Compared to the muskets fielded by other armies of the era, would you say the Brown Bess was on a par, better, worse, or is that a difficult question to answer?
I think a lot of that, and that the arguments for answers to that question, in a nutshell, no. Militarily speaking, musketry of the French was just as effective as musketry of the Prussians or whatnot. As far as the weapon goes, I think a lot of the choice between them and the people stating their choice between them revolves a lot, perhaps, with the way they look, the way they feel, the shape of the stock. But in the end, they're all flintlock smoothbore muskets that use bullets in the military context that are, reduced windage. So given those constraints, I can't see how the Charleville musket is any less effective or more effective than the Brown Bess. It's a smaller caliber. The French muskets were 6.9 caliber at the bore. So the bullets would have had to be, and I'm not up in my French ammunition, but if we take a similar ratio, are they like 0.6? So they're smaller. I have heard it read that there was some sort of British soldiers could use French ammunition in a pinch, but the reverse would not be the case because they wouldn't be able to hammer down a .69 ball with the paper in a 6.9 barrel, especially if it was fouled. Okay. But in terms of, were they effective? Was one more effective than the other? Was one prone to fouling more? No. They're smoothbore, and there's no lubrication on the cartridge. It's just plain paper. So, in a nutshell, no. And I'm just trying to think of things that you could use to measure them against. And would a smaller caliber ball fly better through the air, or worse through the air? Would there be less velocity? Would it carry its velocity more? These are sort of some things that you can perhaps argue the point. But are you really establishing, aspects that really separate it from other muskets, as an example? And I can't see it. That you might be able to prove it at a range, target shooting. That, oh, look, I fire 10 rounds and the grouping's this big with the Brown Bess, and I fire 10 rounds and the grouping's, this big. Well, militarily, that means nothing. Absolutely nothing. If you're shooting like this with a French musket and you're shooting like this with a Brown Bess, that makes a difference. But you're not. You just simply are not. And so I think more has to do with the bigger picture of musketry in general, how it's delivered, when it's delivered in that moment in battle, the ability of the men in terms of their platoon exercise, drilling and loading fast, and also the timing on the battlefield, the tactical timing, the delivering of fire, and the follow up by assault or a charge, as it were. These are all things that come much more into play when we look at the results on the battlefield. At Albuherra, which is one of the perhaps best known examples of what essentially becomes a musketry duel, at really close range, that the battle ebbs and flows over a very small battlefield, but what predominates there, and cavalry attacks coming out of nowhere notwithstanding, is this like toe-to-toe slugging it out, shooting at one another without any kind of immediate attack. In this case, the French are attacking, and the British are meeting that attack and defending. But the casualties incurred on both sides are horrific, with essentially the French withdrawing, as opposed to a decisive attack or a charge made and a rout that, by the point at which the battle ends, everyone's too exhausted to do anything. And that's simply either exhausted, but also militarily exhausted in terms of casualties. There's just no one there. The battalions are completely shot up. They're not big enough to operate. The brigades aren't big enough to form any kind of determined attack in terms of the British, because literally they fought themselves to a standstill. And there's an account that I was reading just recently in preparation for one of the projects, and it just talks of the constant closing into the center that was going on, so that the battalions had lined up, but through casualties, when all of a sudden the guy beside you goes down, you close into the colors, which are in the center of the battalion. So people are having to, they fired their musket, and then, oh Jesus, there's a big gap, off to my side. Well, as I'm loading, I'm shuffling over, and the sergeant or the corporal behind me is reminding me of this. It's like, close in, because we want to maintain our frontage, sort of the continuity of our frontage, and not have individual spaced across. So this constant closing is happening, and that is because of the fire of the musketry. And we speak of the effectiveness of one or the other. Both sides suffer like that, both sides. And if one musket was really more effective than the other, when you're putting it in a position like that, where you're literally standing toe to toe and belting it out for hours, then there's a bit of a withdrawal and a respite, and then they come again, and everything grinds to a halt, and more firing takes place. If one musket was really that more effective, then it would be shown in a battle like that, because there was no territorial advantage. The slopes, I've been there, I've stood on the ground, and the slopes involved there are not insurmountable. It's not like they were climbing up their fields. They're plowed fields. So is there a grade to march up? Yes, there is. Is it a scrambly, like rock, scale, or what's the word I'm looking for? Like a scree slope or something that would provide a physical barrier? Absolutely not. And it's a question of marching up, a rise. So you essentially can take terrain, out of a 50-yard musketry duel in that sense. There's no walls to hide behind. There's no brush in between you to have to navigate. None of that. It's just literally across an open field. There's no crest of a hill that you're hiding behind. Especially when you get to that range, that 50-yard range, the elevation that you gain at the ground there, or from the ground at Albuherra, essentially doesn't mean anything in the way I saw the battlefield.
One thing that sort of blows my mind is how long the Brown Bess was in service in one form or another with the British Army. Can you just sort of give us a brief explanation of how long it was in service and when they eventually phased it out?
Right. Well, I mean, the flintlock comes into service in its earliest forms, like we're talking the doglock and all that kind of thing, as we talked about at the beginning here, in this very late 1600s, and becomes the de facto military arm, like at Blenheim. And what was Blenheim? 1704? 1703, 1704, the Battle of Blenheim. It's around there. Duke of Marlborough So, it was the flintlock was the arm of the era by that point. And essentially the technology, once that land pattern musket comes in and sort of formalizes the Army, standardizes the Army pattern of firelock, it lasts up until the early 1840s before, especially in colonial posts, it finally gets replaced. I think I was reading a description of a campaign in China during one of the Opium Wars, and it talks about the use of the flintlock smoothbore musket at the very twilight of its operational sort of use. I might be wrong. I'm just, again, off the top of my head, that as I recall reading, there was a mixture. So there was percussion smoothbores in service in certain battalions, but some battalions hadn't received them yet. So they were still using the flintlock. And that very much would have been the India pattern musket. A point that we didn't really brush on was the introduction of the what was called the new land pattern, which again was a further refinement of the economies, as it were. The stock was less ornate. The lock was much more plain than it had been even on the India pattern, but essentially it was still the same flintlock smoothbore musket. So capability-wise, it did gain those inches back to the shortland status, and it was intended to replace the India pattern. But then the Napoleonic Wars really got going, and they realized we can't afford to retool everything and go with a new pattern of musket. Apparently, there were some made. There's talk that they had been issued to the Guards for the 100 Days campaigns, which culminates in the Battle of Waterloo. So the Guards may have had the new land pattern, but after that, and may have maintained their use, but there weren't that many made. So keeping them within a small organization like the Guards, and being sort of the longer weapon, the better weapon, perhaps arguably, but the India pattern musket remains in service right to the end of the 1730s and into the 1740s.
1840s.
So I mean, that's a huge window of service for a flintlock smoothbore musket that essentially, capability-wise, let's call it, doesn't change at all. Obviously, it does change pattern-wise. The details change, but the caliber remains, notwithstanding the changed reduction from 7.8 to 7.5. The capabilities remain the same. It's subject to the same weather conditions and the effect of that weather on the musket. The same method of ignition is prone. The flint is fallible. The tempering on the frizzen, what we call today the frizzen, the hammer, it's fallible. So all these things come into play. It's interesting because how could technology, I don't say stall, but maintain for so long? It's an incredible question, and they're just I don't know what it was. I mean, you can point to what actually started it, and that was Forsyth, who invented fulminated mercury, if I'm not mistaken, which leads to the adoption and the creation of percussion ignition, right? Which is the next big thing that comes around with the 1839 musket, issued in the early 1840s, and then subsequent to that, the 1842 musket, which again is issued into the 1840s, and is used really for the last time in the Crimea. So you're talking about the Brown Bess. Brown Bess, in its colloquial historical mention, including percussion versions, as it were, lasting until the 1850s. And even into the late 1850s, the Indian Mutiny sees all kinds of use of the 1842 pattern in the British Army, as well as the East India Army as well. So, it's incredible when you look at that. And to ask that question of why it lasted so long, I don't know. That just flintlocks lasted for 150 years, and that's how long it took before an invention supplanted that kind of thing. Maybe a lot of it had to do with the comfort level that there's no need to change it because it works. The way we fight, it works. We can make it work. And then, you look at the differences over 150 years, and from 1850s to let's call it 1900. Look at the change that happens, basically from the Brown Bess to the magazine rifle, and all the things that happen in between that. I mean, the Victorian era. It just the curve, that technological invention curve, as it were, just gets on a rocket and shoots into the sky. It's really fascinating, and why things lasted so long as far as the Brown Bess goes. I don't really have an answer. It's just the technology just didn't get invented or implemented, really.
And then I guess just to wrap up then, Rob, you've got a Brown Bess. You've now fired it quite a lot. How fond of the weapon are you? How much do you enjoy shooting with it, and why?
Yeah, it's been great fun. I actually, and it made one small appearance on the channel. But I actually had a reproduction Brown Bess from quite some time ago, and that was like well before the channel got started up. And it was a reproduction that made in India, and it's an India-made reproduction of an India-patterned Brown Bess, and it had some interesting characteristics about it. It was made of some of which were aesthetic. Some of which were mechanical. It fires. It's safe. It fires fine. But I did notice some peculiarities in the bore, and quite frankly, I when I got it, I sort of launched into it, and I don't know. I got distracted. I think the channel has given me cause to revisit the Brown Bess, and in doing so, it's become much more interesting to me, because it's not just owning a firearm and shooting it, and oh look, I can only hit something at 75 yards. Okay, to some people that may not be fun, but then revisiting it and looking at the greater context in terms of the anecdotal stuff, like the battlefield kind of things that we've talked about so far, but also the technical aspects of it, and also the exercise, the manual, the platoon exercise, the drills associated. So really the whole encompassing military context of it is really, it's very interesting. And I can think of a number of projects that I have either on the go or, on the docket that I really want to, put it through its paces and see what it can do and see the results I get and match those against preconceptions, but also, anecdotal kind of stuff as well, as best as I can, of course, as the channel always likes to do. So I enjoy it much more now than I did when I got that reproduction. Some of which has to do with my eventual acquisition of a real one. Mine dates from 1820, and as I've been told, I'm not much of a provenance kind of guy. I'm not a person who goes out of their way to get a specific firearm because of a specific type or a pattern, or its markings and where it's been and all that kind of stuff. I certainly appreciate that kind of that collector aspect to it, and those that do, again, I greatly appreciate and the things that they learn about them. But for me, it needs to be, and I think we talked a little bit about this in our first discussion way back when, was that what's important to me is that it's representative of the type. And mine is actually, well, I've been told it dates from 1820, and it was a part of a contract let out by the government, the colonial government of New Brunswick, which is a province in Canada. At the time, in 1820, it was a separate colony. Canada wasn't a country back then. And so these individual colonies would then be responsible for their own defense, for their own, raising and equipping of their own militia. So they essentially contracted the trade in the UK that we need 10,000 muskets or whatever the number was. And so they put the contract out and it gets bid on, and the trade in the UK, whether it be in London or Birmingham, among other places, they make a bunch of muskets for, who's the customer again? New Brunswick. Where is that? Doesn't matter. Let's get it on the ship and get it to the docks, and it'll get to where it gets, that kind of thing. So it's very much a second type India pattern Brown Bess, and I saw it, and I sort of had to do a little bit of what's the word, bookkeeping to make that happen. But I did, and money well spent as far as I'm concerned. That it has the features, it has the feel. I mean, it's a real one. And I compare it to my reproduction, and there really isn't a comparison. That it feels better, the lock is better, it shoots better, believe it or not. I to this day, I think there's something funny with the reproduction bore that when I load it, I feel about halfway down that things get really, really loose. So I'm wondering if there is a somewhat taper to the bore. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The Brown Bess that I have now doesn't suffer from that at all. And you can feel the barrel it's a proper military musket. And I can feel these differences. And then, so part of my sort of rediscovering of it, as it were, comes from that aspect as well. That having a real one in my hands and being able to put it through its paces is something that combining it with the military aspects and sort of really re-energized the look at it. So yes, I greatly appreciate firing it. I enjoy it. The only thing I could say that is not even lacking, but it's just different, is that whole range accuracy piece. Because, you know, I mean, I've shot my P53 out to 700 yards. I just shot the Martini out to 700 yards, not overly effectively, mind you. Just the other day, you know, those kinds of things those rifles are capable of doing that. The Brown Bess simply isn't, and you have to just shrink your world right down to get an appreciation. Again, we spoke about it earlier, is that understanding of these ranges that these battles took place at, as far as the musketry aspect goes, are just minuscule when you compare to anything later, you know. So I greatly enjoy it. I'm really enjoying getting the series on the channel up and running. I've done 2 videos now, an introductory video, as well as a video featuring a comparison between it and the Baker, which we'll talk about perhaps some other time. And, you know, again, I've got a number either on the go or on the docket that I want to get up and running and really provide that thing that so much of the Brown Bess especially is anecdotal. But to bring the musketry side of it into play as far as presenting that to the public is something that the realities of it are often unavailable. And so I'm really looking forward, as I say, to getting into that and presenting it as I do on the channel.
Brilliant. I mean, for anyone who's listening or watching, you should really check out Rob's series on the Brown Bess. I was watching your comparison with the Baker rifle earlier, and there's some very interesting conclusions which I won't give away now, but which I found quite surprising and very interesting. So thanks for all the great work you're doing, Rob. So guys, I hope you enjoyed listening to that as much as I did. Rob really is a font of knowledge and also a true gentleman. If I'd have been a redcoat at Talavera or Salamanca, I'd have been very happy to have him as my sergeant. So before you go, please do remember to subscribe and to write a 5-star review. In the next episode, I'll be taking a deep dive into the early life of Sir Arthur Wellesley alongside my good friend Josh Proven from the blog and YouTube channel Adventures in Historyland. You don't want to miss that.